more puzzling it becomes, we're talking about World War II.
That's right. And our mission today isn't just to recap the battles. We're diving into this core historical consensus that when you look at every material metric, this war was completely and utterly unnecessary.
And yet, it happened. It consumed the entire globe, killed upwards of 65 million people, and I mean, it permanently changed everything.
It did. And it often framed as this simple moral struggle, the good war against fascism. And on one level, it was. But if you strip away that immediate moral clarity and look at the origins, the geopolitics, the ideology, you realize the war itself was just a monumental political failure.
Political failure. How so?
It was a failure rooted in really a catastrophic loss of deterrence. And that failure is what allowed what should have been border skirmishes, regional ambitions, to escalate into this 6-year catastrophe. A catastrophe that was, and this is the key, mathematically impossible for the aggressors to win.
Okay, that's the central contradiction we need to unpack. The sources we're looking at really approach this by first highlighting just how incoherent the war itself was.
Yes.
If you talk to anyone who lived through it, or if you read the memoirs, you realize very quickly this wasn't one single event.
That's a great place to start with that personal perspective. I mean, there's that often cited family story that really brings it home. Imagine you had an uncle fighting the Japanese in the Aleutians, freezing cold, island hopping, just brutal.
Okay.
At the exact same time, you have a cousin stationed in Iran. His job is coordinating the transfer of American Dodge trucks and supplies over the mountains to the Soviet Union.
A completely different world.
And then you have a third cousin, maybe, rolling across France with Patton's Third Army.
Yeah.
Mechanized warfare in Europe.
They weren't fighting the same war, not even close. Different uniforms, different climates, different enemies.
Different everything. The scale was planetary. You had fighting in the jungles of New Guinea dealing with tropical diseases, and then massive tank battles on the frozen Volga River. You had desert warfare in the Sahara, and German U-boats sinking tankers just a few miles off the coast of Miami, which was all lit up.
So if everything was so different, the enemies, the settings, the objectives, what was the one thing that actually unified this incredibly mismatched group of allies?
Right, because they were a motley crew.
A huge understatement. You've got parliamentary Britain desperately trying to hold on to its empire. You've got the anti-colonial United States, which was deeply suspicious of British ambitions. And then you've got Joseph Stalin.
Arguably the biggest mass murderer of the 20th century.
So what on earth did they have in common?
It's fascinating because their unity was purely reactive. It was entirely defensive. They didn't share an ideology. They didn't share geopolitical goals. And they certainly didn't share any kind of moral standard.
So what was it?
They had only one thing, just one single thing in common. Every single major Allied power had been attacked or had their vital interests attacked by an Axis power, Germany, Italy, or Japan.
So their common ground was just mutual survival.
Precisely. The core of the Allied alliance was pragmatic. It was cynical, but it was effective. Their mission wasn't to create some perfect New World Order. It was just to defeat the people who started the fight.
And realizing that the Axis attack was the only thing holding them together, that's the foundation for this whole deep dive, isn't it?
It is. So our mission today is, it's a bit complex. First, we'll dissect the sheer scale of the destruction, because that's what makes World War II historically unique. Then we'll trace the sequence of these political failures, specifically American isolationism, British and French appeasement, and Russian collaboration.
The three catalysts that allowed the Axis to launch a war that, as you said, they could never, ever have won on paper. Okay, so let's move from those political failures to the human cost, because this is where it just gets historically grim. We have to start by setting a benchmark here. When we talk about World War II, this isn't just a 20th century version of the Napoleonic Wars.
Not at all. We are talking about an event that is unique in the history of human destruction. It surpasses anything that came before it by an order of magnitude.
The lethality of it, it almost challenges our ability to comprehend it. The statistics are, they're staggering. And as you mentioned, they keep rising as more research comes out.
They do, especially concerning the vast and poorly documented atrocities in China and in Eastern Europe.
When the war ended in 1945, what was the initial reported death toll?
It was around 40 million.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, that number felt completely unimaginable.
I can't even fathom it. But now,
current research, especially when you incorporate the civilian deaths in China, in Poland, in the Soviet Union, it places the estimated death toll somewhere between 60 and 65 million people.
65 million. How do you even put that number into context?
You have to compare it to other world catastrophes. This single 6-year conflict was more lethal than the Great Plague of the 14th century, the Black Death.
The plague that wiped out up to a third of Europe's population.
Exactly. And even more astonishingly, if you take the death tolls of all the wars fought in the 300 years before 1939, I mean, from the 30 Years' War through Napoleon, all the way up to World War I, you combine all of those.
And it still doesn't match.
It still does not match the staggering scale of World War II casualties. The cost was just so sustained, so relentless.
I saw a stat in the notes that just floored me. The daily death toll.
It's hard to wrap your head around. 27,000 people died every single day for 6 straight years.
That level of sustained industrial scale death is what makes it unique.
And that leads to the most defining feature of all this suffering. The victims were overwhelmingly civilians. This wasn't a war primarily fought between soldiers on a battlefield.
What's the percentage?
80%. 80% of those 65 million fatalities were civilians. Men, women, children. Targeted by strategic bombing, by genocide, by deliberate starvation and terror.
And here's the paradox that just breaks the simple narrative of winners and losers. The losers, the Axis powers, they were the ones who did most of the killing.
75%. 3/4 of the total casualties were killed by the side that lost the war. That inversion is just shocking.
Give us an example.
Japan. Japan lost the war, catastrophically. But they killed approximately 17 million people, mostly in China. It's 7 times more people than lost themselves.
7 times.
And Germany, despite its own horrific military losses, was responsible for the systematic murder of millions upon millions of innocents across Europe. And this points directly to the ideological and technological factors that were driving this unprecedented lethality. It was way beyond standard warfare.
So let's break those factors down. Why was this war so uniquely good at killing people? The sources highlight 5 key drivers that all kind of came together perfectly in 1939. And the first one is the simplest: sheer numbers.
Yes, we sometimes forget this critical demographic context. World War II was the first major mechanized global war fought when there were 2 billion people alive on the planet.
Right.
So naturally, when a conflict of this scale breaks out, the death tolls are just going to be higher because the population base is larger. You combine a massive population with mechanized warfare, the result is guaranteed catastrophe.
Okay, that makes sense. The second factor is the true global scale of it. We call World War I a world war, but the sources say it wasn't really, not in the same way.
Absolutely. World War I was primarily fought in the trenches of Europe and the Ottoman Empire. It really lacked a significant Pacific theater. World War II, on the other hand, was truly, truly global.
You mentioned the U-boats off Miami.
Exactly. The supply lines stretched into the Arctic, across the Himalayas. The fighting ranged from New Guinea and the Aleutians to the coast of South America, where the German battleship Admiral Graf Spee was hunted down and scuttled off Uruguay.
To sustain a war like that, it has to cause death everywhere.
In every corner of the globe, yes.
Okay, the third factor is, well, it's a grim testament to human ingenuity, the technological zenith of the West. The war happened at the exact moment Western technology was peaking, and they turned it on each other.
This is a crucial distinction. This wasn't, the British fighting the Zulus with a massive tech advantage. This was highly industrialized nations fighting other highly industrialized nations, leveraging technologies that had just hit peak efficiency.
Like the internal combustion engine.
Exactly. Suddenly you have rapid transport, you have planes flying at 400 or 500 miles per hour, you have instantaneous communications, which let generals coordinate massive, lethal attacks across entire continents.
And the specific weapons that came online during this period really show that jump.
Oh, the arsenal was terrifying. We saw the first use of napalm, the V-2 rockets, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missiles. You had the development of strategic heavy bombers like the B-29, capable of leveling entire cities from 30,000 feet.
And of course, the bomb.
And of course, the plutonium and uranium atomic bombs. This concentration of advanced mass destruction technology applied relentlessly for 6 years. It guaranteed a colossal death toll.
Now, factor number 4 is the defensive gap. And this is key to understanding the high casualty rates on the battlefield itself.
Right. This refers to the historical cycles in warfare, where the advantage shifts between offense and defense. In World War II, for the entire 6 years, offensive weapons just vastly overpowered defensive capabilities.
It's the opposite of World War I, then.
The complete opposite. In World War I, defense was dominant. You had static trench systems, improved machine guns. It led to these bloody stalemates where you'd lose thousands of men to gain a few yards.
But in WWII, the speed of the offense just outpaced protection.
It did. The rapid mechanization, the speed of tanks and aircraft, it completely outpaced the ability to protect the individual soldier. I mean, today we have ceramic plates and Kevlar that can stop a rifle round. That level of personal protection was just inconceivable in World War II. The average soldier had a thin steel helmet, and that was about it.
So the shells and bullets were just as lethal as today, but the armor wasn't there.
Correct. That lack of adequate defensive armor, combined with the offensive power of tanks and planes, meant that when forces met, the casualty rates just went through the roof.
And finally, the fifth factor, and this is maybe the most insidious one, the influence of a new ideological relativism. This explains why the losers, the Axis, were so good at killing civilians.
This is where the moral fabric of conflict was just torn apart. The rise of these new 20th century secular atheistic ideologies, National Socialism, Italian fascism, Soviet communism, they introduced a moral relativism that sanctioned unlimited violence.
They twisted philosophies to serve their own ends.
They did. They synthesized and bastardized ideas from figures like Wagner, Nietzsche, even Darwinian eugenics, and twisted them into these systems where the state or the race was the ultimate decider of what was moral.
And the core idea was that the exalted ends justified any means necessary.
Exactly. If your exalted end is the long-term survival and supremacy of the master race, the Volk, or the radical equality needed for a communist future, then any action mass murder, systemic starvation, genocide, it wasn't just permissible, it was required.
It removed the traditional moral guardrails.
Completely. It allowed for the murder of 6 million Jews or the systematic extermination of the Polish intelligentsia without any internal moral contradiction inside these aggressor states. The ideology itself gave them permission. It turned the entire globe into a lab for unchecked nihilism.
So we understand the lethality, but for the first year and a half until late 1941, nobody in the West really believed it would reach that global scale, did they?
No, not at all. The initial stage of the war in Europe was defined by the stunning, almost unbelievable speed of the Axis conquests.
And that speed gave Hitler this overwhelming sense of his own genius, his own infallibility.
It did. I mean, look at the timeline. Poland, despite fighting fiercely, fell in 28 days. Though with Soviet help, of course.
And then Scandinavia?
Denmark was conquered in a single day. Norway took a comparatively long 6 weeks.
But the real shocker, the moment that defined this failure of deterrence, was the collapse of the Western democracies. These were the powers that won World War I.
And yet, in May and June of 1940, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, and France, they all fell. In just 7 weeks.
7 weeks? You have to compare that to World War I.
On the Western Front in World War I, Germany suffered 1.1 million casualties to gain just 70 miles of ground. In 1940, Hitler conquered an area roughly the size of the modern European Union, and he lost only about 100,000 soldiers doing it.
It was a massive victory at a minimal cost.
For him, by early 1941, the war in the West was basically over. The only thing stopping him was Winston Churchill's stubborn refusal to negotiate during the Battle of Britain.
Which brings us to the core paradox that every historian struggles with. Why? Why did this happen so fast when the Allies were, on paper, materially stronger?
The material strength was absolutely on the Allied side. I mean, let's look at the numbers from the sources. The Allied military in the West was almost 4 million soldiers strong.
4 million?
Yeah. 3 million French, 500,000 from the Netherlands and Belgium, and about 300,000 from the British Expeditionary Force. They outnumbered the initial German invasion force.
And their equipment was better too, wasn't it? At least in some cases.
In many cases, it was technically superior, yes. The Allies had over 3,000 tanks. The French Char B tank, for example, had a 75mm gun that was far better than what most German tanks had. The Mark I or III Panzers, many of them didn't even have a proper main gun.
And what about in the air?
In the air, British and French fighters, the Spitfire, the French Dewoitine, they were comparable or even superior to the German Bf-109.
So if the French had the manpower, the Maginot Line, better tanks, how do you collapse in 7 weeks? It should have been a deadlock.
The missing ingredient was deterrence. And by that we mean the psychological will, the political will, the tactical will to draw a firm line and say no further.
And when deterrence fails, it doesn't earn you respect.
It breeds contempt. profound contempt from the aggressor.
And Hitler's own attitude at the time is the perfect illustration of this. His own general, like Halder and Beck, they were warning him not to invade France. They were reminding him of the catastrophe of WWII.
And Hitler just dismissed them. His famous response after the Munich crisis in 1938 was just chilling. He said, "I've seen them at Munich and they're worms."
Wow.
He saw their desperate attempts to compromise, their fear of conflict. He didn't see it as diplomacy. He saw it as weakness, as decadence.
So deferring to a bully when you have the power to stand up to them, that doesn't earn appreciation. It earns contempt.
Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, he supposedly mocked Neville Chamberlain for his niceness and his famous umbrella. These became symbols of a political class that was desperate to avoid a confrontation at any cost.
So they sacrificed their material advantage because they had lost the political will to fight.
They'd lost the conviction to enforce the peace they'd won just 20 years earlier.
And the sources give some just incredible, almost ridiculous examples of this pre-war psychological failure, this idea that soft power would somehow just negate totalitarian aggression.
The examples are almost comical if they weren't so tragic. In France, as early as 1928, they actually outlawed putting any mention of the triumph at Verdun in their school books.
You're kidding. They wanted to erase the memory of their greatest victory.
They wanted to erase the memory of the glory and the necessity of that defense. They preferred a kind of national amnesia over national preparation. It shows a profound cultural exhaustion.
And what was the one from Holland?
In Holland, in 1930, they literally renamed a naval destroyer to a flotilla leader because the word destroyer was considered too provocative to German sensibilities.
That is the definition of wishing a problem away.
It is. And of course, there's the infamous 1933 Oxford Debating Society resolution. This house will in no circumstances fight for its king and country.
That moment just encapsulates the collective failure of an entire generation of Western leadership, doesn't it?
It does. They decided they weren't willing to lose a few thousand soldiers now, which guaranteed the loss of 60 million people later.
And that psychological failure, it translated directly onto the battlefield in 1940. It wasn't just about will, it was about tactics and logistics.
Exactly. The Germans were using radios, concentrating their forces into these powerful armored spearheads. The French were still relying on pre-WWII doctrines, dispersing their superior tanks, and they lacked effective radio communication between their units.
So the German tanks weren't better, but their doctrine and their urgency were.
Infinitely better. German pilots were flying 5 missions a day. French pilots flew 2. German logistical columns were prioritized. French tanks literally ran out of gas and were just abandoned on the side of the road.
So the failure of deterrence becomes an operational failure.
It becomes a total operational failure. You have figures like Rommel literally swimming across the Meuse River because the French bridging equipment was delayed by logistical paralysis. They had the better kit, but they lacked the psychological and logistical backbone to use it, and that led to a catastrophic and completely unnecessary collapse.
Okay, so that collapse of Europe was about a failure of will, not a failure of material. And our sources argue that this psychological collapse set the table, but the war only went global because of what they call an unholy trio of political forces.
Right. American isolationism, British and French appeasement, which we've covered, and crucially, Russian collaboration. This combination created the perfect storm for a global war.
So let's start with the United States. After World War I, we rejected the League of Nations. We refused to enter into a security alliance with Britain and France. Why?
Largely because of this widespread American belief that the Treaty of Versailles had been too punitive, too harsh on Germany, and that it was setting the stage for another war.
And the source describes this as one of the 2 stupid mistakes in the history of war.
It is. The U.S. insisted on being punitive with the war guilt clause against Germany, and then compounded that mistake by being completely weak, totally unwilling to actually enforce the peace through collective security.
The very deterrence that could have stopped Hitler was right there, and we refused to provide it.
Think about it. Had the U.S. simply committed to a mutual defense pact with Britain and France after World War I, a simple guarantee that if Germany invaded, 2 million American soldiers would immediately ship out, just like they did in 1917.
Hitler never would have risked it.
You almost certainly would never have risked invading Western Europe after he took Poland. That single geopolitical commitment would have instantly restored the deterrence that Britain and France had squandered.
But instead, the U.S. political class was stuck on what the source calls the wrong reading of history, about World War I.
Completely.
Yeah.
They blamed the war on arms merchants, on secret alliances, on greedy capitalists, rather than seeing it for what it was: aggressive German imperial ambition.
The argument that Versailles was too harsh, it just falls apart when you look at what happened after World War II, doesn't it?
It completely collapses.
Mm.
After 1945, the Allies occupied Germany, they cut it into 4 zones, they stationed troops there for decades, and they oversaw complete denazification. That was far harsher than Versailles. And what's the result? Post-1945, Germany is a peaceful, stable democracy.
So it wasn't the severity of the treaty, it was the failure to enforce it.
Exactly. And to really hammer this point home, you have to look at Germany's own war aims in World War I. Had they won, their September program included annexing all of Belgium and the French Channel ports.
And what they actually did to Russia is even more telling.
The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918. It's often forgotten, but it was incredibly punitive. Germany annexed 1 million square miles and 50 million people from Russia. It was a blueprint for total subjugation, far harsher than anything Versailles proposed.
So Hitler wasn't reacting to some unique punishment. He was just seizing an opportunity.
An opportunity created by American isolationist weakness. By backing away, the U.S. humiliated Germany with a war guilt clause, but then removed the global security system that could have actually held them accountable.
Okay, so if U.S. isolationism removed the threat from the West, Soviet collaboration actively armed the aggressor. This is the final catalyst, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939.
This was the geopolitical green light for Hitler. It secured his eastern flank. It allowed him to invade Poland and then turn his full attention to the West without fear of a two-front war.
Hitler himself said he never would have done it otherwise.
He did. But the collaboration went so much further than just not fighting. It was direct, massive material support.
The amount of resources the Soviets gave Hitler is just jaw-dropping.
It is. Think about the heart of the Blitzkrieg, the tanks, the planes. Between 1939 and mid-1941, the Soviets provided the Third Reich with 30% of its oil.
30%.
30% of its wheat. Nearly 20% of critical metals needed for armaments, like chromium and tungsten. This was the fuel and the raw material that allowed the Wehrmacht to roll over France.
There's that incredible story about Churchill confronting Stalin about this later.
Yes. Later in the war, when Stalin was constantly berating Churchill for not opening a second front fast enough, Churchill famously shot back. He reminded Stalin that the German bombers killing people in London in 1940 were being fueled by oil from the Caucasus.
Oil supplied by the Soviet Union. The irony is staggering.
And it reveals Stalin's total cynicism. Of the 6 major powers in the war, he cut a deal with every single one of them at some point.
He honored the Axis deals better than the Allied ones, didn't he?
He did. He never once violated the terms of the non-aggression pact with Germany before they invaded him. And you have to remember the secret protocols of that pact. It wasn't just about not fighting.
It was about carving up Eastern Europe.
Exactly. The secret protocols divided Poland, the Baltic states, parts of Romania.
Yeah.
They divided it all up between the two totalitarian powers. Stalin wasn't just securing his border. He was actively collaborating in the dismemberment of sovereign nations, using Hitler as his battering ram.
And even after Hitler invaded him in 1941, he kept his deal with the other Axis power, Japan.
Yes, he signed a non-aggression pact with Japan in April 1941. And that pact was so strong that even while Japan was fighting a massive war against the United States, Japanese forces would strictly ignore American Liberty ships full of war material sailing to the Soviet port of Vladivostok.
Unbelievable. So collaboration secures the flank and fuels the machine. Appeasement convinces them the West is too weak to fight, and isolationism ensures the American giant stays asleep.
The 3 elements align perfectly. The stage was set entirely by political and psychological failure, not by some inherent Axis military superiority.
So this confluence of failures, isolationism, appeasement, collaboration, it leads directly to 3 huge events in the second half of 1941 that turn this from a European war into a true global Holocaust.
These are the 3 tipping points. And the first one is arguably the most strategically foolish decision of the entire war for the Axis.
Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa.
Right. And as we just discussed, nobody thought Hitler would be so, for lack of a better word, stupid.
It defied all logistical sense. He was attacking his most valuable supplier.
Exactly. Between 39 and 41, the Soviets were giving the Third Reich more resources every single month than Germany could loot from the entire rest of occupied Europe in a whole year. To attack your own lifeline makes no sense.
But his ideology overrode his common sense.
His ideological imperative, The quest for Lebensraum, living space, and his desire to wipe out Judeo-Bolshevism, it completely overrode military logic.
And you have Germany with 80 million people invading the Soviet Union with 180 million, and yet they almost won.
They came frighteningly close. The front stretched for 1,500 miles, from the Balkans all the way to St. Petersburg. The crisis was so extreme that German soldiers in Army Group Center, driving on Moscow, claimed they could see the spires of the Kremlin on December 5, 1941.
That was the moment it became a total continental catastrophe.
And the moment that started draining Germany's finite resources.
Then, just 6 months later, the second event, Pearl Harbor. And this was another decision driven by contempt, a misreading of Western will.
It's a common misconception that Japanese leaders like Admiral Yamamoto respected American power. The sources argue the opposite. Having lived in the U.S., Yamamoto and Foreign Minister Matsuoka developed contempt, not respect.
They saw Americans as soft.
Decadent, soft, preoccupied with nice cars and spats, lacking the spiritual discipline of the Yamato race.
And Yamamoto genuinely believed that one devastating slap on the face would shock the U.S. into negotiating a peace.
His calculation was based entirely on the assumption of U.S. political weakness, which had been reinforced by years of American isolationism. The logic was basically, any country that won't help Britain while it's burning down in 1940 surely won't care about a few battleships at Pearl Harbor.
A fundamental misjudgment of the American psyche.
A catastrophic misjudgment. And again, the material paradox here makes a decision strategically insane.
They attacked a country with a vastly superior industrial base.
And a superior navy in total tonnage. Critically, at the moment of the attack, the United States had 27 fleet carriers already on order. Within 2 years, the U.S. would build 151 carriers of all types. Japan started a war with the one power whose industrial capacity they had completely misunderstood.
And finally, the ultimate blunder that guaranteed a global, unwinnable war. Germany declares war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor.
Even though the U.S. had only declared war on Japan, why would Hitler give Roosevelt a two-ocean war without a fight in Congress?
It's the most strategically inexplicable act of the war.
Even for Hitler, he offered all these rambling, inconsistent reasons. Sometimes he said he was helping his U-boat commanders who were tired of the neutrality rules, even though they were already sinking millions of tons of shipping.
Other times he said he felt obligated to Japan.
Despite having betrayed them with the Soviet Pact in '39. But the real reason was just hubris. He fundamentally believed the Americans were cowboys who would take 4 or 5 years to mobilize their industry. He thought he could beat the Soviets and the British before the U.S. was even a factor.
He didn't realize that by declaring war, he had just unified the entire industrial and demographic might of the world against him.
And those 3 events, Barbarossa, Pearl Harbor, and Hitler's declaration of war, they were the definitive tipping point. The war was now global, and it was now inevitably lethal beyond anything humanity had ever seen.
Okay, so we've established that the Axis powers were mathematically destined to lose. If that's true, how do we even characterize the 6 years of fighting?
The core question becomes this. Could the Axis, who had rearmed earlier and had combat experience, defeat the Allies before the Allies could fully rearm and mobilize? The answer was a resounding no, and that sealed their fate.
The war became a contest between factory floors, not generals.
That's a great way to put it. The Axis killed 80% of the dead, but the Allies built over 80% of the munitions. In World War II, industrial production was just vastly more important than initial military aggression or even operational genius.
Now, calling the victory easy feels wrong when 65 million people died.
That's a necessary clarification. The victory was assured. It was mathematically inevitable. It was not, however, cost-free. The Allies had the political will to endure the horrific costs necessary to see that math problem through to its conclusion.
The Axis had to win fast because the industrial divide was just too big.
Overwhelmingly so. Let's look at the simple metrics of that industrial chasm. Start with manpower. The Axis powers had about 200 million people under their direct control.
And the Allies.
The major allies, the Soviet Union, the US, Britain, had well over 400 million people, not even counting their vast colonial resources. The demographic base was just impossible for the Axis to overcome in a long war.
And when you look at equipment production, the numbers just become absurd.
Take tanks, the supposed icon of the Wehrmacht. The Soviet Union produced 70,000 tanks. The US produced 55,000. Germany, the master of the panzers, produced only 20,000.
Even Britain alone outproduced them.
Yes, Britain, an island under siege, produced more tanks than Germany did throughout the entire war.
The disparity in air power is almost impossible to comprehend.
Globally, about 600,000 aircraft were built during the war. The United States alone produced 400,000 of them, two-thirds of the world's total.
And then there's the most damning metric of all, the heavy bomber.
This one is just staggering. Germany, Japan, and Italy, the three primary aggressors, never built a single four-engine heavy bomber, not one. The US and the UK produced 40,000 of them.
40,000 long-range strategic bombers capable of destroying the enemy's homeland that the Axis had no answer for.
And that industrial capacity was all powered by the US gross domestic product. By 1945, the US GDP was larger than the GDPs of Germany, Japan, Italy, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined.
Once America mobilized, it was over. The only question was the price.
That's right. But beyond sheer industrial muscle, the sources argue the Allies just had better politics and better cooperation, which amplified their material advantage.
First, a more appealing message.
The Allied message was fundamentally defensive. The Atlantic Charter, Roosevelt's Four Freedoms, it was all centered on fighting aggression and not taking land. That was far more appealing to neutral countries and colonial subjects than the Axis ideology of superior races, the Yamato, the Raza, the Volk.
Second, the critical element of trust, at least between the democracies.
While the alliance with Stalin was a cynical marriage of convenience, Roosevelt and Churchill were dependable partners. They were honest with each other. This is in stark contrast to the Axis.
Right. Hitler constantly lied to Mussolini.
Constantly. Mussolini's son-in-law, Count Ciano, wrote in his diary that they had to lie back to Hitler because they knew he was lying to them about major decisions like invading Russia. There was zero trust.
And that distrust just sabotaged any hope of a coherent Axis strategy.
Yeah, completely. When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, Hitler didn't even know where it was. Later, when Hitler was planning Barbarossa, he asked Japan to help by invading from the east. What had Japan just done? They'd signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviets.
Doing to Hitler exactly what he had done to them.
This constant double-crossing made any real strategic coordination impossible.
Third, the division of labor. The Allies actually planned together.
The agreement with the Soviets was strategically brilliant. Their job was simple: fight on one front and kill German soldiers. They weren't expected to build a navy or bomb Japan. And they delivered, killing 75% of all Wehrmacht soldiers.
And the US and UK supplied the logistics to keep them going.
The Lend-Lease aid was indispensable: 2,000 locomotives, 375,000 Dodge trucks. Goering famously complained that the Allies were fighting an oil war while Germany was fighting a grass war because their divisions were 70% horse-drawn.
Fourth, and maybe the most powerful lesson, was the cross-fertilization of technology.
The Axis failed at this completely. The Japanese had the best torpedo in the world, the Long Lance. The Germans had the best fuel-injected aircraft engine. They never shared or integrated these technologies because of nationalistic distrust.
But the Allies were masters of integration.
When the U.S. Sherman tank proved inadequate against German Panthers, the British immediately shared their powerful 17-pounder anti-tank gun. They created the Firefly Sherman, which could destroy a Tiger tank from a mile away. It was a cheap, effective solution.
And the P-51 Mustang.
The perfect example. The British added their incredible Rolls-Royce Merlin engine to the American P-51 airframe, and it instantly became arguably the best long-range fighter of the war. That kind of cooperation was a huge force multiplier.
And finally, the Allies actually had a coherent idea of how to win.
They had a conception of victory: destroy the enemy's homeland, four-engine bombing of capitals, a naval blockade, and a land invasion leading to unconditional surrender. The Axis never had this. Goering was asked how Germany would bomb New York, and he just mumbled about a fantasy America bomber.
Yamamoto was asked how Japan would stop Detroit.
And he had no answer. They started a war with powers whose industrial heartland they had absolutely no way of ever reaching. It was a strategic failure from day one.
So after 65 million deaths to prove a mathematical certainty, the war finally ends in 1945. But the outcomes were just as complex and ironic as the origins. Let's look at the final score for the major players, starting with the Soviet Union. The biggest winner and the biggest loser.
That's the perfect way to describe it. Their losses were just horrific. 27 million dead, 50 million people occupied, much of it because of Stalin's own initial stupidity and collaboration. And yet, despite that carnage, they emerged in the most advantageous strategic position in their entire history.
They became a superpower.
They did. All of Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Ukraine. It was all now communist or under Soviet domination. There's that cynical joke from a Soviet diplomat to the British: you guys went to war to stop totalitarianism, and you've ensured its success by making us your ally.
Painfully true. Then there's Great Britain, maybe the most admirable of all the allies.
The most idealistic. They were the only country to fight from the very first day to the very last.
Ah,
And they were the only major power to go to war strictly on principle to defend an ally, Poland.
and they fought brilliantly, outproduced Germany, avoided the insane casualties of WWII.
They did. But the post-war outcome was tragic for Britain. They had mobilized to such an unprecedented degree that they were flat broke by the end. The subsequent socialist policies meant that within a decade, flattened countries like Germany and Japan were becoming industrial powerhouses, Mercedes, Honda, while Britain's own industries declined.
And they gave up their empire.
Willingly. Their immense moral sacrifice came at an unsustainable economic cost.
Italy, meanwhile, pretty much got a pass.
They quit in 1943, and after 2 years of civil war, the Allies essentially let them off the hook, arguing they weren't really involved in the worst of the ideological horrors.
Japan, though, paid a massive price in devastation, even if their military losses weren't as high as the Soviets.
They were the most vicious aggressor, killing some 17 million in China while losing only 3 million themselves. But the key distinction is that while the U.S. burned down 40% of their cities, we never invaded their home islands.
So the surrender was unilateral, without a final ground battle.
Exactly. And the source suggests that because of this, Japan never fully dealt with the reality of their defeat or their past atrocities face to face.
And you can still see hints of that selective memory today.
You can. There's that chilling modern example. The Japanese recently launched a large new carrier and named it the Kaga, the same name as one of the lead carriers at Pearl Harbor. It suggests a country still grappling with the full meaning of a defeat that was delivered from the air, not on the ground.
And finally, the United States. We achieved all of our aims.
Unconditional surrender, occupation, securing the peace. We lost only 425,000 people, the smallest percentage of any major ally. We ended the war with the world's largest military and the largest GDP. But that total success created an immediate and profound post-war dilemma.
The Cold War.
Right. The dilemma was that the U.S. was instantly forced to rebuild the bad guys, Germany, Japan, Italy, into democracies and indispensable allies against our former ally, the Soviet Union.
So we had to tell Poles and the Chinese that the people who started the war were now our friends.
And at the same time, the Soviets were busy painting the U.S. and U.K. as the new fascists. That immediate geopolitical pivot set the stage for the next 50 years of global conflict, all flowing directly from the ashes of World War II.
So what does all this mean for us today? The sources frame this war not just as history, but as a kind of laboratory, a barometer.
That's right. War, at its core, is what proves who is stronger materially, industrially, and in terms of sheer willpower when all other arguments have failed. It provides the final brutal truth.
And the final crushing irony of World War II is that it all happened to prove a banality, a truth that should have been self-evident to any sober analyst in 1939.
It was physically, mathematically impossible for Germany, Italy, and Japan, with their limited resources, to ever defeat the combined economic and demographic power of the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain.
And yet it took the deaths of 65 million people to prove that simple equation.
All because of American isolationism, British appeasement, and Russian collaboration. A catastrophic failure of global deterrence.
And that leads us to the final provocative thought we want to leave you with. If deterrence is the price of peace, the willingness to draw a line and enforce it now to prevent a much bigger cost later, what seemingly minor political or strategic decisions are we making today?
What choices are we making that sacrifice deterrence for comfort that could be guaranteeing an inevitable catastrophic conflict tomorrow?
A profound thought on the enduring lessons of political failure. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.